The morning sun beat down mercilessly on Fort Benning's Whiskey Jack Range, casting harsh shadows across the barren Georgia landscape. Heat waves shimmered above the parched earth, distorting the view through
Wow, did
high-powered
you see
scopes.
that shot?
Gunnery
He
Sergeant
actually hit
Ryan
it.
Mitchell squinted through his state-of-the-art thermal optics, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cooling system in his tactical gear. For the sixth time that morning, he adjusted the settings on his wrist-mounted Kestrel ballistic computer, a piece of technology worth more than most people's monthly salary. Recalibrating, he muttered to his spotter. One reading at 7 miles per hour left to right. Mitchell's Elite Force Recon sniper unit had been attempting the same shot for over 3 hours now. The steel silhouette target stood mockingly at 1,700 yards, just shy of a mile away, undamaged and untouched, despite dozens of attempts from the six-man team. Each shooter had cycled through, each had failed, and the morning's frustration hung in the air as palpably as the Georgia humidity. "Something's off with these readings," Mitchell said, his voice tight with controlled irritation. He was 35 with the chiseled features and hardened confidence of a career Marine. Tattoos peeked from beneath the edges of his multicam uniform, and his eyes, sharp blue and calculating, betrayed no self-doubt despite the continued failures. He tapped the ballistic computer again, watching as complex algorithms calculated bullet drop, spindrift Coriolis effect, and a dozen other variables. The technology represented the pinnacle of modern military advancement, designed specifically to take the guesswork out of long-range shooting. Yet the target remained untouched. The younger Marines shifted uncomfortably behind him. They'd been kneeling in the dirt for hours, their knees-aching faces sunburned, despite liberal application of camouflage paint. None dared voice their frustration, but it showed in their tense shoulders and tight expressions. Lance Corporal Jason Turner, the youngest at 25, adjusted his spotting scope once more. "Maybe there's something we're not accounting for, Gunny," he ventured cautiously. Mitchell shot him a look that would have withered a lesser man. "The equipment is fine, Lance Corporal. The shooter is the problem." He gestured for Private First Class Rodriguez to take position. "One more try. Use my Kestrel readings exactly as I give them to you." Rodriguez settled behind the .300 Winchester Magnum sniper rifle, a masterpiece of engineering with its carbon fiber stock, titanium action, and computerized scope that displayed wind values, temperature, and humidity in real time on a heads-up display. The group fell silent as Rodriguez controlled his breathing, following the rhythm they'd all been taught: inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, pause for 4. His finger took up the slack in the match-grade trigger. The rifle cracked its report, echoing across the range. 2.5 seconds later, the time it took for the bullet to travel the distance, there was nothing but silence. No metallic ring of a hit, just another miss. Mitchell's jaw clenched. "Impossible," he hissed. It was at that precise moment that the strange figure appeared at the edge of the firing line. He moved slowly with a slight limp, his weathered boots raising small puffs of dust with each step. The man was ancient by military standards, easily in his early 80s, with skin tanned and creased like old leather from decades under the sun. He wore faded jeans and a simple button-up work shirt, the sleeves rolled to reveal forearms corded with lean muscle that belied his age. A groundskeeper's badge hung from his belt, but it wasn't his appearance that drew all eyes. It was the long, cloth-wrapped object he carried in his gnarled hands, with the reverence one might reserve for a religious artifact. Mitchell's head snapped up, his patience already exhausted. "Is this some kind of joke?" He barked, his voice slicing through the tense silence. He wasn't addressing his Marines, his glare fixed squarely on the old man standing quietly behind the firing line. "Do you even know where you are, old man?" Elijah Harper, 82 years old and unbothered by the hostility, said nothing. His eyes, pale blue like a winter sky, were focused not on Mitchell, but on the small flags placed at various distances downrange. Each told a different story, fluttering in seemingly contradictory directions. To the casual observer, they moved randomly. To Elijah, they sang a complex symphony. "This is an active live fire range for forced reconnaissance snipers." Mitchell continued, stepping toward him. Every inch of the gunnery sergeant exuded modern military prowess, from his tactical boots to his digital camo uniform, adorned with combat patches. "Civilian presence is strictly prohibited. I need you to leave now." Elijah's gaze drifted from the windswept terrain to Mitchell. His eyes held a depth that seemed to absorb the younger man's aggression without reflecting any back. The corners of his mouth turned up slightly, not quite a smile, but an expression of gentle understanding. The wind is tricky today. Elijah said, his voice a low, calm rumble that seemed to carry the weight of decades. It's not just one wind, it's three. Mitchell let out a short, incredulous laugh. A few of the younger Marines shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. They had been struggling all morning, their state-of-the-art wind meters giving conflicting readings. The ballistic computers spat out firing solutions that proved useless time and time again. Three winds right, Mitchell scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. Listen, Pops, I appreciate the folk wisdom, but we have equipment for that. He tapped the sophisticated device on his wrist. We're dealing with Coriolis effect spin drift and barometric pressure that changes every 5 minutes. It's a little more complex than holding up a wet finger. Elijah offered a simple, non-confrontational shrug. That computer of yours can't see the thermal updraft coming off those rocks at 1,000 yards, he said, pointing to a rocky outcropping halfway to the target. And it can't feel the downdraft from that ravine on the left. His weathered finger traced the line of a depression to the west of the range. The flag at the target is lying to you. It's showing a left to right, but the valley is funneling a current in the opposite direction just this side of it. Lance Corporal Turner lowered his spotting scope. He'd been watching the mirage boil and churn all morning, the heat waves creating visible distortions that indicated wind direction and speed. What the old man said made a strange kind of sense. The heat waves were flowing in different directions at different distances, creating layers of conflicting air currents. But he wouldn't dare voice that observation to Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. Mitchell's face tightened, his professional pride stung. This old groundskeeper, he'd seen him mowing the grass near the barracks, was lecturing him on long-range marksmanship. And I suppose you could do better, he challenged, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured at the long, cloth-wrapped object in Elijah's hands. What have you got there anyway, Grandpa's square rifle? Slowly, deliberately, Elijah began to unwrap the object. The Marines watched with a mixture of curiosity and derision as the cloth fell away. It wasn't a modern tactical rifle with a carbon fiber stock and an adjustable chassis. It was a thing of wood and steel, a relic from another era. The walnut stock was dark with age, and linseed oil scarred and dented in a way that spoke of a long, hard life. The action was a familiar bolt-action design, and the scope mounted on top was simple, with none of the complex turrets and reticles of the modern optics on the line. It was an M40, the rifle of a bygone era, something they'd only seen in museums or historical photos. The snipers stared. That rifle was a legend, something they'd only seen in training manuals or historical photos. To see one here in the hands of this old man was surreal. Mitchell let out a disbelieving chuckle. You cannot be serious. You think that antique can even reach the target, let alone hit it? The barrel on that thing is probably worn smooth. He pointed at the rifle stock at a particularly deep gouge near the bolt. Look at this thing. It belongs in a museum. You're going to hurt yourself. The moment Mitchell's finger pointed at the worn wooden stock, the shimmering heat of the range dissolved in Elijah's mind. Reality faded, replaced by vivid memory. The world went tan and brown. He was no longer 82, but 48. The air wasn't dry with Georgia heat. It was scorching with the merciless sun of the Iraqi desert during Operation Desert Storm in 1991. The smell of sand and cordite hung heavy in his lungs. His mouth was parched, lips cracked from dehydration, despite the careful water rationing from his canteen. He was lying on his belly in a shallow depression atop a sand dune, perfectly still, his heart a slow, steady drum against his ribs. He held the same rifle, its walnut stock already showing years of use, but still newer than it would become. The gouge Mitchell had mocked was fresh, a shard of shrapnel from a mortar round that had landed too close just hours before. Sand had worked its way into every crevice of his uniform, his skin raw where it chafed against the coarse grains. Sweat evaporated almost instantly in the desert air, leaving salt crystals that burned against his sunburned skin. He'd been in position for 14 hours, unmoving, waiting. Through the simple scope, he watched a small outcropping of rocks a half-mile away. An enemy heavy machine gun team was setting up a position that would pin down an entire company of Marines advancing through the valley below. The intelligence had been correct. The ambush was being prepared exactly where they'd predicted. Elijah's breathing was the only thing in the world he could control. The desert was alive with wind currents, hot air rising from sun-baked rocks, cool air rushing down from higher elevations, and the prevailing winds swirling unpredictably around the valley walls. His spotter, a young corporal named Martinez, whispered the wind call, "I'm showing variable 7 to 12 knots quartering from 10 o'clock." But Elijah wasn't listening to the words. He was watching how the fine sand particles danced across the dune's ridge. He noticed how the heat mirage boiled up differently at various distances. The enemy's position was 200 yards away, well within the rifle's range, but complicated by the three distinct wind patterns between him and the target. He made his own adjustments, ignoring the data from the primitive wind meter. This wasn't science. It was art. He let half a breath out and held the crosshairs settling not on the machine gunner, but at a seemingly empty point in space 2 feet above, and to the left, a spot that made no sense according to the textbook, but perfect sense to someone who could read the desert's subtle language. Elijah squeezed the trigger. The bullet traveled through three distinct wind currents, each one capable of pushing it off course. But Elijah had read them as clearly as words on a page. The round found its mark. Through his scope, he watched the machine gunner drop. A second shot neutralized the assistant gunner before either man understood what was happening. The Marine company below would never know how close they'd come to disaster. The report would simply state that an enemy position had been eliminated by sniper support. But those 16 hours in the baking sun, reading the wind's complex patterns, had saved dozens of lives. That night, back at the forward operating base, a colonel had approached Elijah's tent. "They're calling you something out there," he said without preamble. "The desert ghost. That shot shouldn't have been possible in those conditions." Elijah had simply nodded. He understood something that the ballistic computers and wind meters would never comprehend. The wind wasn't just data. It was a living thing with moods and patterns. You didn't measure it, you listened to it. The memory ended with the quiet thud of the suppressed shot, a sound swallowed by the vastness of the desert. Back on the range at Fort Benning, the sun beat down. Elijah's eyes refocused on Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. The old man's expression hadn't changed, but something in his presence had settled, become heavier. He had heard the mockery, but it didn't land. The rifle was not a museum piece. It was a part of him. "This rifle has taken lives and saved more," Elijah said quietly, running his thumb along the worn stock. "It will reach your target just fine." Lance Corporal Turner watched the entire exchange, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He was a good Marine. He respected the chain of command, but he also respected his elders, and the gunnery sergeant's blatant disrespect felt wrong. More than that, there was something about the old man, a flicker of recognition in the back of his mind. He'd seen him around the base for years, always quiet, always keeping to himself. But he'd also heard stories, whispers from the old salts at the Armory legends about the quiet groundskeeper who used to be somebody. Mitchell was now fully committed to his course of action. His own failure on the range had curdled into anger, and Elijah was the perfect target. "I am not going to ask you again, sir," he said, the honorific dripping with sarcasm. "This is a restricted area. You are a civilian, and you are creating a safety hazard. Put that weapon down and step away from the firing line." Elijah made no move to comply. His eyes continued to study the range, reading the complex patterns of wind and heat that the Marines' equipment was failing to capture. Turner knew he had to do something. He couldn't confront the gunny directly, but he could intervene in another way. "Gunny," he said, standing up, "my spotting scope's reticle is swimming. I think the nitrogen seal broke from the heat." He held up the expensive piece of equipment. "Permission to take it to the repair shop at the Armory." Mitchell, distracted and annoyed, waved a dismissive hand. "Whatever. Just get it fixed. We're not packing up until we hit this target." Turner grabbed his scope and jogged away from the firing line, his heart pounding. He didn't go to the repair shop. He ducked behind a line of Humvees, pulled out his phone, and found the number he was looking for. The phone rang twice before a grizzled voice answered. "Armory, Master Gunnery Sergeant Phillips speaking." "Master Guns, it's Lance Corporal Turner from Charlie Company," Turner said, keeping his voice low and glancing back toward the firing line. "Turner, what can I do for you? Don't tell me you broke another $30,000 scope." Phillips said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "No, Master Guns. I'm out at Whiskey Jack Range with the Gunny Mitchell's team." Turner lowered his voice further. "You're not going to believe this. Gunny Mitchell is tearing into that old guy who helps tend the grounds, the quiet one." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Phillips spoke again, his voice had lost its casual tone. "The old man with the limp? That's him," Turner confirmed. "But Master Guns, he brought a rifle with him, an old M40, and the gunny is about to have him arrested for trespassing." Turner hesitated, then added, "He called him Elijah Harper." The silence on the other end of the line was sudden and absolute. It stretched for a full 5 seconds. When Master Gunnery Sergeant Phillips spoke again, his voice was completely different. It was tight, urgent, and stripped of all its earlier gruffness. "Son, are you telling me that Elijah Harper is on that range right now?" "Yes, Master Guns," Turner replied, a new kind of dread creeping up his spine. "Stay right there, Turner," Phillips ordered. "Do not under any circumstances let Gunny Mitchell put a hand on him. Do whatever you have to do. I'm making a call. Just keep him there." The line went dead. Turner stood behind the Humvee, the spotting scope clutched forgotten in his hands. He had the distinct feeling he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. Colonel Marcus Reynolds, the commanding officer of the Marine Special Operations School, was in the middle of a budget meeting that was making him wish for the relative simplicity of a firefight. His aide, a young captain, knocked and entered without waiting for a response, his face pale. "Sir, I apologize for the interruption," the captain said, "but there is a priority call on your direct line from Master Gunnery Sergeant Phillips at the main armory. He said to tell you it's a Whiskey Alpha protocol." Colonel Reynolds frowned. There was no such thing as a Whiskey Alpha protocol in the official Marine Corps lexicon, but he knew Phillips was a man who had forgotten more about the Corps than most officers ever learned. He didn't engage in hyperbole. Reynolds picked up the phone. "This is Reynolds." He listened, his posture slowly stiffening, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the receiver. His side of the conversation was short-clipped and escalating in intensity. "What at Whiskey Jack range with Gunny Mitchell's team?" A pause. "Who did you say is there?" Another pause, longer this time. The color drained from Reynolds' face. "Say that name again." There was a long pause as Phillips repeated the information. The colonel's eyes widened, a look of profound shock washing over his features. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. He listened for another moment, then slammed the phone down onto the cradle with a crack that made the captain flinch. Reynolds stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The budget meeting was forgotten. "Captain," he barked, his voice a low command that broke no argument. "Get my vehicle now. Tell the base sergeant major to meet me at the front entrance in 2 minutes. We are going to Whiskey Jack Range. Lights and sirens all the way." Back at the range, Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell had reached his breaking point. The old man's placid refusal to be intimidated was more infuriating than any argument could have been. "That's it. I'm done with this circus," Mitchell declared, his voice rising. He took a step closer to Elijah, invading his personal space. "Sir, I am giving you a direct order to vacate this military installation. If you refuse, I will place you under apprehension myself and have the MPs escort you to a holding cell." To emphasize his point, he reached out and placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder, intending to guide him away from the firing line. "You are interfering with a live-fire exercise and endangering my Marines. We're done talking." Elijah didn't move. He didn't even flinch. He simply looked at the younger Marine's hand on his shoulder, then up at his face. The look in his eyes was not anger, not fear. It was something closer to pity, a profound, weary sadness that made Mitchell falter, despite himself. Turner had returned to the edge of the firing line, watching the confrontation with growing alarm. Phillips had told him to prevent any physical contact, but Mitchell already had his hand on the old man's shoulder. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. That was when the first siren cut through the air. It started as a distant wail, a sound so out of place on the remote range that everyone stopped. All heads turned toward the long dirt road leading from the main base. A plume of dust was rising, growing larger by the second. It wasn't one vehicle. It was a convoy, 2 Black Command Humvees and a military police cruiser, their lights flashing silently in the bright sun, speeding toward them at a pace that tore up the road. The Marines at the firing line stood frozen, unsure what to make of this unexpected development. Mitchell's hand remained on Elijah's shoulder, but the certainty had drained from his face, replaced by confusion. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the firing line doors, flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first man out was Colonel Reynolds. His uniform was immaculate, his face a mask of cold fury that made every Marine present instinctively straighten their posture. Following right behind him was the base sergeant major, a man who looked like he had been carved from granite with 30 years of Marine Corps service etched into every line of his face. The entire range went deathly silent. The snipers who had been watching the confrontation between their gunny and the old man snapped to attention. Mitchell froze his hand still on Elijah's shoulder, a look of utter confusion and dawning horror spreading across his face. He had been in the Corps for 15 years and had never seen the base commander and the sergeant major arrive anywhere, let alone a firing range with such speed and intensity. Colonel Reynolds ignored Mitchell completely. His eyes were locked on Elijah. He strode forward, his boots crunching on the gravel, stopping directly in front of the old man. He looked at Mitchell's hand on Elijah's shoulder, and his eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. Mitchell snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned. Then the unthinkable happened. Colonel Reynolds, a full colonel in command of the most elite training facility in the Marine Corps, snapped to the sharpest, most breathtakingly precise salute Mitchell had ever seen. His back was ramrod straight, his arm locked at precisely the right angle, his gaze one of pure, unadulterated respect. "Mr. Harper," the colonel's voice boomed across the silent range. "Sir, I apologize for the conduct of my Marines. There is no excuse for the disrespect you have been shown here today." A collective silent gasp rippled through the line of young snipers. Their gunnery sergeant looked like he had been turned to stone. His jaw was slack, his face ashen. He had gone from being in complete command to being the object of a colonel's wrath in less than 30 seconds. The sergeant major walked over to Mitchell and spoke in a low, terrifying whisper that nonetheless carried to the nearest Marines. "Gunnery Sergeant, what in God's name did you think you were doing?" Reynolds held his salute until Elijah gave a slow, almost tired nod. Only then did the colonel drop his hand. He turned to face the stunned group of snipers, his voice cold and hard, carrying the weight of absolute command. "Marines," he began, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "You have been failing this test all morning because you believe the technology hanging off your rifles makes you marksmen. You have been humbled by a mile of air." His eyes swept over the young faces, each one now a mask of shame and confusion. "And in your frustration," Reynolds continued, his gaze settling on Mitchell, "your leader chose to aim his disrespect at a man whose boots he is not worthy to polish." He gestured toward Elijah. "For your education, allow me to introduce you to the man you have been disrespecting." His voice took on a formal, almost ceremonial quality. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Harper, retired. He quite literally wrote the doctrine on high-angle and extreme crosswind shooting that you are all failing to apply." The revelation hit the group like a physical force. "Lieutenant Colonel?" The groundskeeper was a retired lieutenant colonel. Reynolds wasn't finished. In Desert Storm, they called him the Desert Ghost. Colonel Harper holds the third longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history, a shot he made in a sandstorm with winds that would make today look like a calm breeze. The colonel paused, letting the words land with maximum impact before adding, "And he made that shot with the very rifle your gunnery sergeant just called a museum piece." Mitchell stood rigid, the blood drained from his face, his career flashing before his eyes. He had just disrespected, threatened, and physically laid hands on a living legend, a man whose exploits were taught in sniper school. Reynolds turned back to Elijah, his demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Harper, sir, would you do us the honor of showing these men how it's done?" Elijah nodded slowly. He walked to the empty, firing position, not with the brisk efficiency of the younger Marines, but with a slow, deliberate economy of motion that spoke of absolute confidence. He lay down on the mat, settling in behind the old M40 with the ease of reuniting with an old friend. The Marines watched in stunned silence as history unfolded before them. They were about to witness something few living people had ever seen: the Desert Ghost at work. The legend was no longer just a story in a training manual. He was flesh and blood, lying on their firing line, about to deliver a master class in an art they had only begun to understand. And not one of them doubted, not for a single second, that the next sound they heard would be the ring of steel on steel a mile away. The convoy of vehicles had arrived with the urgency of men responding to a national emergency, not a dispute at a firing range. The air around Colonel Reynolds seemed to crackle with authority as he stood before Elijah Harper, rendering a salute that would have passed inspection at the Naval Academy. The younger Marines stared, their eyes wide with shock and confusion. "At ease, men," Reynolds finally said, addressing the frozen snipers who had snapped to rigid attention at his arrival. His voice was controlled now, but beneath it ran a current of carefully managed anger. But stay where you are. You are about to receive an education that no amount of technical training could ever provide you. The sergeant major, a towering figure whose combat ribbons told the story of 3 decades of American military interventions, turned his attention to Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. The look he gave the younger man could have stripped paint. Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell, the sergeant major said, his voice pitched low, but carrying clearly in the still air. You will assume the position of parade rest, and you will not speak unless spoken to. Is that clear? Mitchell swallowed hard. Yes, Sergeant Major, he said, shifting to the formal stance, legs shoulder-width apart, hands clasped behind his back. The confidence that had radiated from him minutes before had evaporated like morning dew under the desert sun. Colonel Reynolds turned back to Elijah, his demeanor softening. Lieutenant Colonel Harper, I hope you'll forgive the reception you have received. These men don't know their history. He gestured toward the rifle in Elijah's weathered hands, or their heritage. Elijah's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the closest thing to a smile he had shown since arriving. No harm done, Colonel, he said. Youth has its privileges. I had much to learn at their age as well. The exchange was cordial, respectful, but it only deepened the mystery for the watching Marines. Mitchell's mind was racing, trying to place the name. Harper, Lieutenant Colonel Harper. The whispered legends began to coalesce in his memory stories told by instructors at Scout Sniper School, tales that had seemed like military mythology rather than actual history. Reynolds addressed the group. Marines, you've been struggling with this shot all morning because you've lost sight of the fundamentals. You've been trusting your equipment more than your senses. He gestured toward the distant target. That mile of air between you and your objective has been teaching you a lesson in humility, but you've been too stubborn to learn it. The colonel's eyes swept over the younger faces, each one now a mask of attention. For your education, allow me to introduce you to the man you have been disrespecting. His voice took on a formal, almost ceremonial quality. This is Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Harper, retired. He quite literally wrote the doctrine on high-angle and extreme crosswind shooting that you are all failing to apply. A murmur rippled through the group. Mitchell's face drained of color. Every Marine sniper knew the doctrine. It was the foundation of the modern sniper program. The chapter on wind reading was considered the definitive text on the subject. It was required reading at Scout Sniper School, and Mitchell had quoted from it dozens of times in his own training sessions. In Desert Storm, Reynolds continued, the Iraqi forces had a name for him. They called him the Desert Ghost. Colonel Harper holds the third longest confirmed kill in Marine Corps history, a shot made in a sandstorm with winds that would make today look like a gentle breeze. Reynolds paused, letting his words sink in. And he made that shot with the very rifle your gunnery sergeant just called a museum piece. The revelation hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He had just called the M40 rifle one of the most revered weapons in Marine Corps history, a squirrel rifle. Worse, he had dismissed the wisdom of a man whose achievements most snipers could only dream of matching. Reynolds turned back to Elijah, his demeanor respectful. Mr. Harper, sir, would you do us the honor of showing these men how it's done? Perhaps they need a demonstration of the fundamentals they've been neglecting. Elijah nodded slowly, his movements unhurried and deliberate. Happy to help, Colonel. Though I'm a bit older than the last time I qualified on the range. A quiet chuckle passed through the group, breaking some of the tension. Elijah walked to the empty firing position, moving with the careful precision of a man who had learned to conserve energy through decades of experience. He lowered himself to the ground, settling behind the old M40 with practiced ease. The younger Marines watched in fascination as Elijah prepared for the shot. There was none of the frenetic energy they associated with the marksmanship drills. No rapid adjustments of equipment, no constant checking of electronic devices. Instead, Elijah simply lay still for nearly a minute, breathing slowly, his eyes tracking the movement of the range flags, the sway of distant grass, the heat mirage rising from the Georgia soil. He didn't use a bipod to steady the rifle. Instead, he rested the forend on his battered old rucksack, a piece of equipment that looked as weathered and experienced as its owner. Your computers are looking for data, Elijah said, his voice calm and instructive, speaking to the silent Marines. You need to look for signs. See that shimmer over the rocks at 1,000 yards. It's flowing right to left. That's a thermal updraft. The Marines followed his gaze, some raising spotting scopes, to see what he was describing. But look at the grass on that berm at 1,500. It's barely moving and it's leaning toward you. The wind is rolling back on itself there. His weathered finger pointed to the flag at the target, fluttering in what appeared to be a steady crosswind. The flag at the target is all the way in the back, catching the main current. It's a head fake. You have to aim for a window in the wind. He made a few quiet clicks on his scope's elevation and windage knobs. They were simple, confident adjustments, base volume, based on a lifetime of observation and experience. He settled his cheek against the worn wood of the stock, a position he had held thousands of times before. The range fell utterly silent. Not a man breathed as Elijah took a deep breath, let half of it out, and held. The crack of the old M40 was sharp, a nostalgic sound from a different war. The Marines knew that sound from historical footage, the signature report of a weapon that had served through Beirut Desert Storm and beyond. Every spotting scope on the line was now trained on the distant target. For a long, breathless 2.5 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, and then faint but unmistakable a sound returned across the mile of shimmering air. The perfect ringing sound of a copper-jacketed bullet striking hardened steel. A dead center hit. A wave of spontaneous applause and cheers broke out from the young Marines. It was a release of the morning's tension and a show of pure respect. Even Mitchell, still standing at parade rest, couldn't hide the look of astonishment that crossed his face. Colonel Reynolds just shook his head, a small admiring smile on his face. He then turned that face, now cold again, toward Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, his voice dangerously low, "your arrogance has blinded you to your duty. Your primary duty is not just to be a good sniper, but to make more of them. You had a living legend, a resource beyond price, standing right here offering you wisdom for free, and you treated him like a trespasser. You have failed." Mitchell stood rigid, his face a mess of shame and regret. "Sir, no excuse, sir," he said, the traditional Marine response when there is no defense for one's actions. "There is no excuse," the colonel confirmed. "You and your entire team will be reporting for 1 week of remedial training in wind estimation and fieldcraft." He paused, letting the punishment sink in before adding, "Your instructor will be Lieutenant Colonel Harper if he is gracious enough to accept the task." All eyes turned to Elijah, who had pushed himself up from the ground, his old joints protesting quietly. He walked over to Mitchell, who couldn't meet his gaze. Elijah placed a gentle hand on the younger Marine's shoulder, the same one Mitchell had grabbed in anger moments before. "The gear helps," Elijah said quietly, his voice devoid of any triumph. "But it doesn't replace what's in here." He tapped his temple with a weathered finger. "The wind doesn't care about your computer, Gunny. It just is. You have to learn to listen to it, not just measure it." The following morning found Mitchell's sniper team assembled at Whiskey Jack Range before dawn. They stood in a loose semicircle, their breath visible in the pre-dawn chill. None spoke. The previous day's revelation and subsequent dressing down had left them in a state of subdued anticipation. Mitchell stood slightly apart from his men, his posture rigid. His career, which had seemed so promising just 24 hours ago, now hung by a thread. He had disrespected a Marine Corps legend, a man whose exploits were literally part of the training curriculum. The story would spread through the Corps like wildfire. His only hope of salvaging his reputation and possibly his career was to embrace this remedial training with absolute dedication. The first pale light of dawn was just breaking over the eastern tree line when Elijah arrived. He walked slowly across the dew-damp grass, that same slight limp in his gait, carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder and his rifle case in his other hand. He wore the same faded jeans and a different but equally well-worn button-up shirt. No tactical gear, no digital camouflage, no technological accoutrements. Just a man and the tools of his craft. "Good morning, Marines," Elijah said, his voice clear in the still morning air. "Thank you for being punctual." The formality of his greeting surprised them. They had expected perhaps resentment or condescension after yesterday's confrontation. Instead, there was only the calm professionalism of a senior instructor addressing his students. "For the next week," Elijah continued, "we're going to forget most of what you think you know about wind reading. We're going to start with the basics, the fundamentals that haven't changed since the first sniper took aim at a distant target." He set down his bag and rifle case. "But first, I want to understand what you've been taught." He turned to Mitchell. "Gunnery Sergeant, please explain your current methodology for wind estimation at extended ranges." Mitchell cleared his throat, painfully aware that he was being tested. Sir, we utilize the Kestrel 5700 Elite Weather Meter with applied ballistics to gather data on wind speed, direction, temperature, and barometric pressure. The device communicates with our scopes to provide firing solutions based on the ballistic profile of our ammunition and rifles. Elijah nodded, his face neutral. And when the Kestrel gives you a reading that doesn't match what you're seeing through your scope, when your rounds are consistently missing despite perfect data, what then? Mitchell hesitated. This was precisely what had been happening yesterday. We recalibrate the deployment and reconfirm our input parameters. I see, Elijah said. He reached into his canvas bag and pulled out a handful of ordinary items, a small bottle of soap bubbles, a few strips of lightweight fabric, a handful of dried grass, and a children's pinwheel. The Marines exchanged confused glances. These were not the sophisticated tools they were accustomed to using. Today, none of you will touch a Kestrel or any electronic device, Elijah announced. Before you can understand what those machines are telling you, you need to understand what they're trying to measure. He handed the items to the Marines, one to each man. Mitchell received the pinwheel, which felt absurdly childish in his large calloused hands. Spread out, Elijah instructed, 20 yards between each man. Move outward from the firing line toward the target. I want observations of air movement at 6 different distances. For the next hour, Elijah had them observe the movement of bubbles, fabric strips, grass seeds, and the pinwheel at various distances. As the sun rose higher, heating the landscape unevenly, the Marines began to notice patterns they had never consciously registered before. Air moved differently over the rocky ground than it did over grassy areas. It swirled around depressions and accelerated over ridges. Most importantly, they observed firsthand how different the wind could be at various distances, sometimes flowing in completely opposite directions. Lance Corporal Turner, who had been the first to sense something special about Elijah, was also the first to grasp what he was demonstrating. It's like layers, he said, watching his fabric strip flutter in a direction completely different from the range flags 100 yards away. The wind isn't one thing, it's stacked. Elijah smiled, a real smile this time, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Exactly right, Lance Corporal. The air isn't a single flow, it's more like a river with currents and eddies moving in different directions at different depths. He gathered them back at the firing line. Your Kestrel is measuring the wind at your position, but your bullet has to fly through multiple wind environments to reach the target. Each one influences its path differently. Mitchell stared at the pinwheel in his hand, still spinning in a light breeze. Such a simple tool, yet it was showing him something his expensive equipment couldn't: the actual movement of air at a specific point in space. Sir, he said, the formal address coming naturally now, our equipment is calibrated to account for wind calls at multiple distances. It is, Elijah agreed, but it's making mathematical assumptions based on algorithms and models. Those models are good, excellent even, but they can't see what you can see. He gestured toward the range. They can't see that heat mirage flowing differently at different distances. They can't see how the grass is bending on that far ridge. They can't feel the change in the air when the wind shifts. He opened his rifle case and removed the old M40, handling it with the casual familiarity of an old friend. The best snipers don't fight the environment at Mernaman, he said. They work with it. They listen to what it's telling them. For the rest of the morning, Elijah had them observe without shooting, just watching, taking notes, sketching wind patterns. It was tedious work, far from the dynamic shooting drills they were accustomed to, but none complained. They were in the presence of a master, and they knew it. As they broke for lunch, Mitchell approached Elijah, the pinwheel still in his hand. Sir, he said, his voice pitched low so the others couldn't hear, I want to apologize properly for yesterday. I was out of line. There's no excuse for how I spoke to you. Elijah studied him for a moment, those pale blue eyes seeing more than Mitchell was comfortable with. Apology accepted, Gunny, he said simply. Now let's see if we can make you the kind of teacher these young men deserve. As Elijah held the old rifle, its weight familiar in his hands, another memory surfaced, brief and warm. The Marines were taking their lunch breaks, sitting in small groups in whatever shade they could find. Elijah sat alone as befitted his position as instructor, but his mind was far away and long ago. He was a young corporal, barely 20 years old, in the dense forests of Fort Bragg in 1958. The Cold War was at its height, and the Marine Corps was developing new capabilities to counter Soviet threats. Among these was a growing emphasis on precision shooting at extended ranges, what would later become the formal Scout Sniper program. A grizzled master sergeant named William Hawkins, a veteran of both World War II and Korea, was pressing this very rifle into his hands. The stock was newer than the bluing on the barrel darker, but it was the same weapon, the prototype of what would later be designated the M40. "She's not fancy, son," the old-timer had said, his voice raspy from decades of cigarettes and shouted commands. "She's heavy, and she'll kick you if you don't hold her right, but she'll never lie to you." Young Elijah had run his hands over the smooth wood of the stock, feeling the quality of the craftsmanship. It was unlike the standard-issue rifles most Marines trained with. This was a precision instrument. "The wind, the heat, the rain, they'll all lie to you." Hawkins had continued, lighting another lucky strike. "This rifle won't. You just have to learn her language, learn to trust what she's telling you." That had been the beginning of Elijah's education, not just in marksmanship, but in the art of reading the environment. Hawkins had taught him to observe, to feel, to integrate himself into the landscape until he could sense changes in the air before they were visible. "A sniper is part shooter, part meteorologist, and part ghost," Hawkins had told him. "You've got to disappear into the world around you, become part of it, listen to it." 4 weeks, Hawkins had forbidden him from firing a single round. Instead, he'd had Elijah lie for hours in different terrain, forest, field, swamp, just watching the movement of leaves, grass, water, clouds, learning the language of the natural world. When Elijah had finally been allowed to shoot, it wasn't at paper targets. Hawkins had set up steel plates at varying distances in a valley where the wind swirled unpredictably. "Don't fight the wind," he'd instructed. "Dance with it." Those first shots had been revelatory. Elijah had truly seen the path his bullet would take before he pulled the trigger. He'd felt the connection between himself, the rifle, and the target, a connection mediated by the air itself. "You've got the gifts," and Hawkins had said after Elijah had hit 7 out of 10 targets in conditions that had defeated shooters with years more experience. "Now you've just got to nurture it." The memory shifted, jumping ahead years to 1991. Hawkins, now in his 80s and confined to a hospital bed at the VA Medical Center in San Diego, his once powerful frame wasted by cancer. The old master sergeant had summoned Elijah, by then a seasoned lieutenant colonel with multiple combat deployments behind him. "You still using that old rifle?" Hawkins had asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Elijah had replied, the old form of address coming naturally despite the reversal in their ranks. "She's never let me down." Hawkins had smiled, the gesture ghastly on his skeletal face. "Good. That rifle has a story. It needs to keep being told." He'd reached out with a trembling hand, grasping Elijah's wrist with surprising strength. "You need to teach them, Colonel. The young ones. They're going to forget what we know. They're going to trust machines instead of their senses. You can't let that happen." Elijah had promised a solemn vow to a dying man who had shaped his life. 3 days later, Hawkins was gone, but the legacy he had entrusted to Elijah lived on. The memory faded, bringing Elijah back to the present. The young Marines were finishing their lunches, preparing for the afternoon session. They were good men, well-trained and dedicated, but they had been taught to rely on their equipment more than their instincts, to trust digital readouts more than their own observations. That Elijah decided was about to change. "Gather round, Marines," he called, standing up with his rifle in hand. "This afternoon we're going to learn about something your fancy scopes can't show you: the story of the bullet's journey." The second day of training dawned overcast, with a capricious wind that gusted and swirled unpredictably across the range. Perfect conditions for what Elijah had planned. "Today you'll shoot," he announced to the eager Marines, "but not like you're used to." He had them remove the batteries from their Kestrel devices and power down their digital scopes. Instead, each man was given a small notebook and told to record his observations of wind conditions at various distances before each shot. "I want you to draw what you see," Elijah instructed. "Sketch the wind patterns as best you can. Note how the mirage is flowing at different distances. Feel the air on your skin. Is it cooling? Warming? That tells you about air density, which affects your bullet." Mitchell struggled with the exercise. Without his electronic aids, he felt blind, reduced to guesswork. His first shots missed by embarrassing margins. He could feel frustration building, the same anger that had led to his confrontation with Elijah just 2 days earlier. but this time he contained it. Instead of lashing out, he forced himself to concentrate harder to truly see what Elijah was trying to show them. By midday, Lance Corporal Turner had made a breakthrough. After meticulously documenting the wind patterns for 20 minutes, he fired a shot that struck just inches from center mass at 200 yards without using any electronic assistance. "I saw it!" Turner exclaimed, his young face alight with discovery. "I could actually see where the bullet would go." Elijah nodded approvingly. "You're learning to read the story the wind is telling you." "That's good work, Lance Corporal." The other Marines redoubled their efforts, inspired by Turner's success. By the end of the day, each had managed at least one hit at extended range using only their observational skills and the basic ballistic data for their weapons. All except Mitchell. The gunnery sergeant remained frustrated, his pride still smarting from the public dressing down, his confidence shaken. When the day's training concluded, he lingered at the firing line, staring downrange as if the distant target had personally offended him. Elijah approached quietly, watching Mitchell for a moment before speaking. "You're trying it too hard, BD," he said. Mitchell turned surprised. He thought everyone had left. "Sir, Bo, you're forcing it," Elijah clarified. "You're so determined to prove yourself that you're not actually seeing what's in front of you." Mitchell's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to consider the criticism objectively. "I'm observing the same conditions as the others," he said. "You're looking, but you're not seeing." Elijah replied. He picked up a blade of grass from the ground, held it up between them. "What do you see?" Mitchell frowned. "A piece of grass." "Look closer," Elijah urged. "Really look." Mitchell studied the simple blade of grass. It was bent, slightly curving in the light breeze. As he watched, he noticed how it moved not just side to side, but with a slight twist responding to the complex currents of air around it. "It's dancing," he said, feeling slightly foolish. Elijah smiled. "Exactly. Everything in nature dances with the wind. Learn to see the dance and you'll know where your bullet will go." He handed Mitchell the blade of grass. "Take this home. Practice watching it move in different air currents by an open window near an air conditioning vent outdoors. Just watch how it responds to the movement of air." Mitchell accepted the simple training aid, oddly moved by the gesture. "Thank you, sir. I'll do that." That night in his quarters, Mitchell sat by the open window of his barracks room, holding the blade of grass in his fingers, watching it respond to the gentle evening breeze. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his career trajectory or his next evaluation. He was simply observing and learning the language of the air. The third day brought a new challenge. Elijah took them to a nearby valley where the terrain created unpredictable wind patterns, unlike anything they had encountered on the flat range. "This is Misery Valley," Elijah announced as they arrived. "The old-timers named it that because the wind here will make you miserable if you don't respect it." The valley was a natural wind tunnel with rocky outcroppings and stands of pine trees that created swirling eddies of air. Flags planted at various distances showed wind directions that seemed to defy logic, some pointing in completely opposite directions despite being separated by only a few hundred yards. "Today you'll apply what you've learned," Elijah said, "but with a twist. You'll shoot in pairs, one spotter, one shooter. The spotter will use the electronic equipment. The shooter will use only their observations. Then you'll compare your wind calls and see who's closer to the truth." It was a brilliant teaching technique. By creating a direct comparison between the electronic readings and their observational skills, Elijah was showing them the limitations of both approaches. Mitchell was paired with Turner, with the younger man spotting first. Turner called out the readings from his kestrel. "Wind at our position is 8 miles per hour coming from 4 o'clock. Humidity 60%, barometric pressure rising." Mitchell, acting as shooter, studied the valley carefully. He watched the way pine needles moved on a distant tree, how the tall grass bent in waves across a field, the way a small dust devil formed and dissipated near a rocky outcropping. "I disagree," he said finally. "The wind at our position is about right, but at 600 yards it's shifting to come from 2 o'clock, and it's faster, maybe 12 miles per hour. Then it slows again near the target and shifts back to 4 o'clock. Turner checked through his high-powered spotting scope, watching the mirage carefully. I think you're right, Gunny," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "The kestrel isn't picking up those changes." Mitchell took his shot, adjusting for the complex wind pattern he had observed. The round struck within inches of the center of the target his first truly successful shot without electronic assistance. A small smile of satisfaction crossed his face. For the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand what Elijah had been trying to teach them. When they reversed roles, Mitchell found himself recognizing the limitations of the electronic data. The Kestrel was giving him accurate information about conditions at his position, but it couldn't see how those conditions changed across the entire bullet's flight path. By day's end, a transformation was underway. The Marines were no longer treating their electronic tools as infallible oracles, but as one source of information among many. They were learning to integrate the data from their devices with their own observations, creating a more complete picture of the environment. As they packed up their gear, Mitchell approached Elijah again. "Sir, I've been thinking about what you said about the story of the bullet's journey." Elijah raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. "It's not just about the wind, is it?" Mitchell said. "It's about understanding the relationship between the shooter, the bullet, and everything in between. The bullet doesn't just fly through the air, it interacts with it. Every gust, every change in temperature or humidity, they're all part of the conversation." A genuine smile spread across Elijah's weathered face. "Now you're getting it, Gunny. That's exactly right." He placed a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. "You're starting to listen. Tomorrow we'll see if you can hear the whole symphony." The fourth morning of training broke with a thunderstorm. Heavy clouds hung low over Fort Benning, occasional lightning illuminating the landscape in stark electric flashes. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof of the small classroom where Elijah had gathered the Marines instead of their usual outdoor location. "Perfect weather for today's lesson," Elijah said as the Marines shook water from their rain gear. Their expressions were skeptical. How could they practice long-range shooting in a deluge? Elijah stood at the front of the room beside a weathered projector screen that had seen decades of military briefings. "Today we talk about what happens when your technology fails you completely." He dimmed the lights and started an old slide projector. The first image showed a barren desert landscape, rolling dunes under a merciless sun. "Iraq, 1991, Elijah said quietly. "My second tour." The Marines leaned forward. They had been curious about Elijah's legendary shot, the one Colonel Reynolds had mentioned, but none had dared to ask directly. "Our intelligence had located a high-value target, an Iraqi general coordinating attacks against our forward positions. He was operating from a remote command post surrounded by a security detail." Elijah clicked to the next slide, a distant compound of low buildings nestled against a rocky hillside. The nearest approach was across 2 miles of open desert with zero cover. A frontal assault would have been suicide. Another slide, a map showing topographical lines and wind patterns. Command requested sniper support. The problem was the distance to 100 yards and the conditions. He clicked again, showing a weather report. Temperature 112 degrees, humidity below 5%, in the sandstorm that was predicted to hit within hours. Elijah paused, his eyes distant for a moment. "My spotter and I set up here," he indicated a position on the map. "We would have one shot before the storm hit and before the target moved. My Kestrel, a much earlier model than what you use now, gave me wind readings. My ballistic tables gave me drop calculations." His voice took on a different quality, more intimate, as if he were sharing a secret. "But when I looked through my scope, I could see the wind was wrong. The Kestrel said 12 miles per hour from the east, but I could see dust devils forming and dissipating at different distances, all moving in different directions. The air near the target was shimming like water, but the pattern was fractured, different currents at different elevations." The next slide showed a notebook page covered in meticulous drawings, arrows, angles, calculations. "I spent an hour just watching, drawing what I saw, learning the pattern." He turned to face the Marines. "The bullet would have to travel through 7 distinct wind environments. No computer then or now could calculate that path accurately." Mitchell raised his hand. "Sir, how did you compensate?" Elijah smiled. "I trusted what I saw, not what my instruments told me. I made a judgment about how each zone would affect the bullet's path. Then I aimed at a point that seemed wrong according to all the textbooks, but I knew it was right." The final slide, a black and white photo showing a younger Elijah kneeling beside his rifle, his face streaked with camouflage paint and dust. Behind him, a sandstorm was visibly approaching on the horizon. The shot connected. The target was eliminated. 15 minutes later, that sandstorm reduced visibility to 0, and we extracted under cover of the weather. He turned off the projector. The point is not to boast about an old war story. The point is that there will be times when your technology is useless or misleading. In those moments, the difference between success and failure will be your ability to read what nature is telling you. As if on cue, the classroom lights flickered as thunder boomed overhead. Elijah smiled. Weather is not our enemy, it's information. Today we're going to shoot in this storm. The Marines exchanged glances of disbelief. Sir, Mitchell ventured, visibility is down to maybe 200 yards in this downpour. Exactly, Elijah replied. So we'll shoot at 200 yards. The principles are the same whether the target is at 200 yards or 2,000. Rain has weight, it affects a bullet's path. Wind pushes rain, showing you its direction and force more clearly than any flag. He led them out into the deluge to a shortened range where targets had been set up at the distance he had specified. For the next 3 hours, the Marines shot in conditions that would normally have shut down any training exercise. They were soaked to the skin, despite rain gear, but not one complained. Elijah moved among them, pointing out how raindrops streaked at different angles at different distances, revealing wind currents invisible to the naked eye in clear weather. He showed them how to judge the density of rainfall and calculate its effect on their rounds. Most importantly, he taught them to embrace adverse conditions as additional sources of information rather than obstacles to overcome. By the time the storm began to clear, each Marine had developed a new appreciation for the complex interaction between their bullets and the environment. They had learned to see weather as a tactical consideration rather than merely an annoyance. As they cleaned their weapons and afterward, Elijah approached Mitchell, who was meticulously drying his rifle with a soft cloth. "Gunny, a word in private," he said. Mitchell followed Elijah to a quiet corner of the equipment shed. The older man studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've made good progress," Elijah said. "Better than I expected given our initial encounter." Mitchell nodded, uncertain where this was heading. "Tomorrow is our final day of training," Elijah continued. "Colonel Reynolds will be observing. There will be a test of everything you've learned." A flicker of concern crossed Mitchell's face. His career might well hinge on his performance tomorrow. "I'm going to tell you something I don't usually share," Elijah said, his voice dropping lower. "Something personal." Mitchell waited, giving the older man time to collect his thoughts. "That shot in Iraq, the one they call the third longest confirmed kill, it wasn't my most difficult shot." Elijah's eyes took on that distant look again. "My hardest shot was one that never made it into any record books. It was a shot I had to take to save my own men in conditions that made that sandstorm look like a perfect day." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. He handed it to Mitchell. The photo showed a group of Marines, much younger versions of Elijah among them, standing beside what looked like a downed helicopter in mountainous terrain. "Afghanistan, 2002, Elijah explained. "Our extraction bird went down due to mechanical failure. No casualties, but we were stranded in hostile territory with limited supplies. A Taliban force had spotted the crash and was moving to encircle us." Mitchell studied the photo. Elijah would have been in his 60s, then well past normal retirement age. "You were still on active duty." "Special advisory role," Elijah said with a small smile. "Old men have their uses in certain situations." He took back the photo, handling it with reverence. "We set up a defensive perimeter while waiting for extraction. I took up a position on high ground to provide overwatch. A Taliban spotter team was setting up on a ridge about 400 yards away, well within range of the M40. But the weather," he shook his head. "Mountain winds that changed direction every few seconds. Temperature drops between sun and shadow that affected air density. Altitude that made standard ballistic tables useless." Mitchell could picture it, the impossible shot scenario that every sniper dreaded. "My Kestrel was damaged in the crash," Elijah continued. "The batteries in my rangefinder were failing. Everything that could go wrong did." He looked directly at Mitchell. "In that moment, all I had was what I could see and what I knew. The modern technology that was supposed to make everything easier had become useless. But the fundamentals, the things I'm teaching you now, they saved those Marines." Mitchell understood why Elijah was sharing this. "You're saying we need both the technology and the fundamental skills." "Exactly," Elijah nodded. "The equipment you have is remarkable. It can make a good sniper great. But if you rely on it exclusively, you're not a sniper, you're just a technician. And when it fails, as it eventually will, You'll be helpless. He put a hand on Mitchell's shoulder. Tomorrow I want you to show Colonel Reynolds that you understand this. Show him that the Marine Corps sniper tradition is in good hands, hands that know when to trust their instruments and when to trust their instincts. Mitchell straightened, feeling the weight of responsibility. I won't let you down, sir. I know you won't, Gunny. Elijah smiled. Because despite our rough start, I see something in you that reminds me of myself at your age, stubborn as hell, but willing to learn when the evidence is right in front of you. As Mitchell turned to leave, Elijah called after him. And Mitchell, get some rest tonight. Tomorrow we'll test everything you've got. Dawn on the fifth day brought perfect cloudless skies, weather so ideal for shooting that Mitchell immediately grew suspicious. He gathered his team early before Elijah was scheduled to arrive. Listen up, he told them, his voice low and urgent. Today's not going to be what it seems. Colonel Reynolds will be here to evaluate us, but the real test will be something unexpected. Harper's been teaching us to look beyond the obvious to see what's really happening rather than what we expect to see. The Marines nodded, trusting Mitchell's instincts. Over the past 4 days, they had developed a new respect for their gunnery sergeant, watching him transform from a technology-dependent shooter to someone who is beginning to truly understand the art of marksmanship. Whatever happens, Mitchell continued, remember everything Colonel Harper has taught us. Trust your observations first, your instruments second. Turner, who had shown the most natural aptitude for Elijah's methods, spoke up. Gunny, do you think we're ready? Mitchell considered the question carefully. We're better than we were 5 days ago. Whether that's good enough, he shrugged. We'll find out today. At precisely 0800, 3 vehicles approached the range. The first carried Colonel Reynolds and the Sergeant Major. The second contained Elijah. The third, unexpected, was a transport truck carrying what appeared to be several other Marine sniper teams. Mitchell felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just an evaluation. It was a competition. Reynolds approached Mitchell's team, his face unreadable. Gunnery Sergeant, today, your team will participate in a modified sniper challenge against teams from 3 other companies. The course has been designed by Lieutenant Colonel Harper to test the principles he's been teaching you. Mitchell maintained his professional demeanor, but inwardly he was calculating the odds. The other teams hadn't received Elijah's specialized training, but they were all experienced snipers with impeccable records. His own team was still adjusting to their new approach. The competition will consist of 3 stages, Reynolds continued. Precision fire at known distances, unknown distance estimation without laser rangefinders, and finally a moving target engagement under environmentally challenging conditions. He gestured toward a hill in the distance. The course has been set up at Wildcat Range. You'll proceed there immediately. Good luck, Marines. As the teams began to gather their equipment, Elijah approached Mitchell. Remember what we discussed, he said quietly. Today isn't about beating the other teams. It's about demonstrating that you understand what I've been teaching you. Mitchell nodded. Yes, sir. We won't let you down. Wildcat Range was notorious among Fort Benning's snipers. Unlike the methodical, controlled environment of Whiskey Jack Range, Wildcat was wild terrain, rolling hills, dense patches of forest, sudden ravines, and constantly shifting wind conditions. It was as close to a combat environment as training could provide. The competition began with what appeared to be a straightforward precision shooting, stage targets at known distances from 300 to 900 yards. Mitchell's team performed well, but not exceptionally. They finished in second place behind a team from Alpha Company, led by Staff Sergeant Ramirez, a sniper with multiple combat deployments and an impressive competitive record. The second stage range estimation without electronic assistance is where Elijah's training began to show results. Mitchell's team used natural reference points and shared observational techniques to estimate distances with remarkable accuracy. They moved into a tied position for first place. As they prepared for the final stage, Turner spotted something unusual. Gunny, look at that, he said, pointing toward the ridge line where the moving target engagement would take place. A series of industrial fans had been set up at various points, massive wind machines like those used on movie sets. Mitchell smiled grimly. Artificial wind currents. Harper wants to see if we can read the patterns. The final stage required each team to engage a remote-controlled target vehicle moving along an unpredictable path at distances ranging from 600 to 1,200 yards. The wind machines created chaotic air currents that changed constantly as the target moved through different zones. The teams from Bravo and Charlie companies went first with mediocre results. Their reliance on wind meters and ballistic computers led them astray as the artificial currents confused their instruments. Ramirez's team performed better, adapting somewhat to the conditions, but still struggling with the complex wind patterns. They managed 3 hits out of 10 attempts, a respectable showing, given the difficulty. Then it was Mitchell's team's turn. As they set up their position, Mitchell gathered them for a final word. "Forget the equipment," he said firmly. "Watch the grass. Watch the dust kicked up by the target vehicle. See how it moves differently in different zones. Draw the wind map in your mind before you take the shot." Turner, as their best natural observer, called wind for the first shooter. "Multiple currents," he reported, watching through his spotting scope. "The fan at our 10 o'clock is creating a right-to-left push for the first 400 yards. Then there's a calm zone until about 800 yards. After that, the crosswind from the fans on the ridge is creating a left-to-right push." The shooter nodded, making mental calculations. When the target appeared moving erratically along its programmed path, he tracked it smoothly, waiting for it to enter a zone where he fully understood the wind patterns. His shot broke cleanly and connected. One by one, each member of Mitchell's team engaged the target. They didn't rush, didn't force shots when the target was in areas with unpredictable winds. They waited for their moments, the windows in the wind, as Elijah had called them. When Mitchell took his turn as the final shooter, the pressure was immense. His team had connected with 7 out of 9 shots so far, an unprecedented performance in these conditions. One more hit would secure their victory beyond any doubt. As he settled behind his rifle, Mitchell was acutely aware of Elijah and Colonel Reynolds watching through spotting scopes from a nearby observation point. Everything he had learned, everything he had come to understand about the integration of technology and natural observation would be tested in this moment. The target appeared moving faster now, as if the operators had decided to increase the difficulty for the final shot. Mitchell tracked it, noting how the dust swirled behind it in complex patterns that revealed the invisible air currents. He had a choice to make: trust his Kestrel, which was giving him a consistent reading that didn't match what he was seeing, or trust his observations. 5 days ago, he would have followed the instrument without question. Now he switched it off and set it aside. "Wind is swirling," Turner reported beside him. "Multiple directions. I can't give you a clean call." "I see it," Mitchell replied calmly. He watched the target, waiting for it to enter a zone where he could predict the wind's effect. The seconds ticked by. The target was approaching a point where it would disappear behind a hill, ending his opportunity. Then he saw it, a moment when the dust pattern stabilized, revealing a clear wind signature. He adjusted his aim to a point that felt intuitively right rather than technically correct. The rifle cracked. The round flew true, striking the target dead center. A perfect hit at 150 yards through artificially created chaotic wind conditions. Cheers erupted from his team. They had achieved 9 hits out of 10 attempts, a score that would have been impressive on a calm day at a known distance range, let alone in these conditions. Colonel Reynolds approached his face, betraying a hint of a smile despite his attempt at maintaining a stern demeanor. "Impressive shooting, Gunnery Sergeant," he said. "It appears Lieutenant Colonel Harper's remedial training has been effective." Mitchell stood at attention. "Thank you, sir. The credit belongs to Colonel Harper and the men of this team. They embraced his teachings without reservation." Reynolds nodded. "The results speak for themselves. I'll be recommending that elements of this training methodology be incorporated into our standard sniper curriculum." He turned to Elijah, who had joined them. "Assuming you're willing to consult on the development of that curriculum, Colonel." Elijah inclined his head slightly. "I'd be honored to contribute, Colonel. These men have reminded me how rewarding teaching can be." After Reynolds departed to congratulate the other teams, Elijah took Mitchell aside. "That final shot," he said quietly, "you didn't use your Kestrel." "No, sir," Mitchell confirmed. "The readings didn't match what I was seeing." A slow smile spread across Elijah's weathered face. "You've learned the most important lesson, Gunny. The technology is a tool, not a crutch. You know when to use it and when to set it aside." He extended his hand. "Well done." As Mitchell shook the older man's hand, he felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for winning the competition, but for gaining a deeper understanding of his craft. In 5 days, Elijah Harper had transformed him from a technician into a true sniper. 2 weeks later, Mitchell found himself in an unexpected location, Colonel Reynolds' office. The summons had come that morning with no explanation. Mitchell had spent the intervening time wondering if, despite the success at Wildcat Range, there would still be repercussions for his initial disrespect toward Elijah. "Gunnery Sergeant Mitchell reporting as ordered, sir," he announced, standing at attention before the colonel's desk. Reynolds looked up from a stack of paperwork. "At ease, Gunny. Take a seat." Mitchell sat, his posture still rigid with anticipation. "I'll get straight to the point," Reynolds said, leaning back in his chair. "Following the demonstration of your team's capabilities at Wildcat Range, I've had discussions with the commandant of the sniper school. We're implementing a new training module focused on environmental reading and integration of observational skills with technology." He fixed Mitchell with a direct look. "We want you to lead the development of this program, working directly with Lieutenant Colonel Harper." Mitchell blinked in surprise. "Sir, you've demonstrated not just the ability to learn these skills, but to apply them effectively under pressure and to lead others in their implementation." Reynolds continued, "Moreover, you've shown something rare in today's Corps, the humility to acknowledge when you need to change your approach." Mitchell swallowed. "Thank you, sir. I'm honored by the opportunity." Reynolds wasn't finished. "There's more. The module will officially be designated the Harper Win Doctrine. Colonel Harper's contributions to sniper methodology will finally receive the formal recognition they deserve." He handed Mitchell a folder. "These are the preliminary outlines for the curriculum. Colonel Harper has already reviewed them and made his recommendations. Now we need you to develop the practical applications." Mitchell accepted the folder, deeply moved by the significance of what Reynolds was proposing. "Sir, may I ask a question?" "Go ahead." "Why me after how I behaved toward Colonel Harper initially?" Reynolds interrupted. "Because of how you behaved afterward, Gunny. You took a humbling experience and turned it into growth. That's the kind of leadership we need for this program." He paused. "And because Colonel Harper specifically requested you." That afternoon, Mitchell drove to a small house on the outskirts of Columbus, Georgia. Elijah had given him the address during their final day of training, telling him to visit when he had something worth discussing. The house was modest, but impeccably maintained, a single-story ranch with a wraparound porch and a garden that showed hours of careful attention. Mitchell parked his truck and approached the front door, the folder from Colonel Reynolds tucked under his arm. Before he could knock, Elijah's voice called from around the side of the house. "Back here, Gunny." Mitchell followed the voice to find Elijah kneeling in a vegetable garden, carefully tying tomato plants to wooden stakes. The old sniper looked different here, more at peace, his movements unhurried, yet purposeful. "Sir," Mitchell greeted him. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Elijah stood slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. "Not at all, I've been expecting you." He gestured toward a pair of chairs on the back patio. "Have a seat. There's iced tea in that pitcher." As they settled into the chairs, Mitchell noticed photographs arranged on a small table nearby, Elijah in his younger days in uniform, at various stages of his career, standing alongside Marines from different eras. One photo showed a much younger Elijah with the grizzled Master Sergeant Hawkins, both holding rifles and smiling against a backdrop of pine trees. "Colonel Reynolds told me about the Harper Win Doctrine program," Mitchell said, placing the folder on the table between them. "He said you requested me specifically." Elijah poured 2 glasses of tea. "I did. You're the right man for it." Even after our first meeting, a smile tugged at the corner of Elijah's mouth. "Especially after our first meeting. You showed me something important that day, Gunny." Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "Disrespect and arrogance." Elijah chuckled. "Passion, conviction, belief in your methods, misguided though they were." He took a sip of his tea. "Those are qualities you can shape and direct, but you can't instill them where they don't exist. You care deeply about being the best at what you do. That's what this program needs." Mitchell considered this perspective. "I still owe you a proper apology, sir." "You've given me one already through your actions." Elijah gestured toward the garden. "See those tomato plants? The ones on the left were planted too close together, and just like I told you at the hardware store. They're competing for the same resources, stunting each other's growth." Mitchell remembered the chance encounter at the store when Elijah had commented on his gardening mistake. "You noticed that just from the dirt under my fingernails." "Observation isn't a skill you turn on and off, Gunny. It becomes a way of life." Elijah leaned forward. That's what I want you to teach these young snipers. Not just techniques for the battlefield, but a mindset that makes them more aware of everything around them. They spent the next hour discussing the curriculum with Elijah, sharing insights from his decades of experience. As the conversation wound down, Mitchell found himself looking again at the photographs, particularly the one with Hawkins. "He was your teacher?" Mitchell asked. Elijah nodded, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Master Sergeant William Hawkins. Fought at Okinawa in World War II, then again in Korea. He taught me everything I know about reading when." He picked up the photo, studying it. "He gave me that M40 when he retired. Made me promise to pass on what he'd taught me." Mitchell understood now the deeper significance of the old rifle, why Elijah had held on to it all these years. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a legacy, a physical embodiment of knowledge passed from one generation to the next. "Is that why you took this job at Fort Benning after retirement?" Mitchell asked. "To keep that promise, partly," Elijah admitted, "and partly because I wasn't ready to fully retire. The Corps gives a man purpose. Even cutting grass and maintaining the ranges, I was still contributing something." He set the photo down. "But I always kept an eye out for teachable moments. Your struggle at Whiskey Jack Range was the perfect opportunity." Mitchell shook his head, smiling ruefully. "You saw us failing for 3 hours before you stepped in." "Sometimes failure is the necessary prelude to learning," Elijah replied. "If I'd approached you when you were still confident in your methods, would you have listened?" "Probably not," Mitchell admitted. Elijah nodded. "The winds of change only affect us when we're ready to feel them." As Mitchell prepared to leave, Elijah walked him to his truck. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway, and birds called from nearby trees. It was a peaceful moment, far removed from the intensity of the sniper range. "One more thing, Gunny," Elijah said. "This program isn't just about making better snipers. It's about preserving something vital to our Corps, the balance between embracing new technology and maintaining the foundational skills that have served us for generations." Mitchell understood. In an age of increasing technological dependence, they were creating a counterbalance, a reminder that the human element remained irreplaceable. "I won't let you down, sir," he promised. Elijah smiled. "I know you won't." He extended his hand. "And Mitchell, next time you plant tomatoes, give them room to grow." 1 year later, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot of the Columbus Farmers Market. Gunnery Sergeant Ryan Mitchell, now the lead instructor for the Harper Wind Doctrine program at the Marine Corps Sniper School, stepped out into the warm Georgia sunshine. The program had proven wildly successful. Snipers trained under the new methodology were consistently outperforming their peers in field exercises and deployments. Mitchell had received commendations from the Marine Corps Commandant himself, but the approval that meant the most to him came in the form of weekly gardening advice from a certain retired lieutenant colonel. Mitchell made his way through the crowded market carrying a small cooler. He spotted his target immediately, an older gentleman behind a modest stand selling tomatoes, peppers, and herbs. Elijah Harper's garden had apparently produced a bumper crop this summer. "Morning, Colonel," Mitchell greeted him, setting down the cooler. Elijah looked up, a warm smile crossing his weathered face. "Gunny, good to see you." He gestured toward the vegetables arranged neatly on the table. The fruits of proper spacing. These tomatoes had room to grow. Mitchell chuckled. "I followed your advice this year." He opened the cooler to reveal several jars of red sauce. "Made my first batch of pasta sauce last weekend. Thought you might like to try it." Elijah accepted a jar, studying it with the same careful attention he gave everything. "Looks good. Italian grandmother's recipe. YouTube tutorial," Mitchell admitted with a laugh. "But I added a few touches of my own." They fell into easy conversation, discussing the progress of the sniper program, Elijah's garden, and Mitchell's recent engagement to a local school teacher. Around them, market goers moved about their Saturday routines, oblivious to the fact that they were passing two of the most lethal precision marksmen the Marine Corps had ever produced. "How's Turner doing?" Elijah asked. Lance Corporal Turner had shown such aptitude for the Harper methodology that Mitchell had brought him on as an assistant instructor. "Being considered for the Marine Corps shooting team," Mitchell replied proudly. "He's taking to teaching even better than I expected. Has a natural way of explaining complex concepts." Elijah nodded approvingly. "He reminds me of you, eager to learn, willing to adapt. The future of the program is in good hands." As their conversation continued, Mitchell noticed Elijah occasionally glancing past him, tracking something with subtle eye movements. Following his gaze, Mitchell saw nothing unusual, just market patrons moving between stalls. "Old habits?" Mitchell asked with a knowing smile. Elijah's eyes crinkled at the corners. "You never stop observing, Gunny. Even here the air tells a story. See that flag over the market office?" He nodded toward a small American flag fluttering in the breeze. "The wind is shifting. Rain coming later today." Mitchell looked up at the cloudless blue sky. "Looks clear to me." "Wait 6 hours," Elijah said confidently. "The barometric pressure is dropping. I can feel it in my knees." A young family approached the stand examining Elijah's vegetables. Mitchell stepped aside, watching as Elijah interacted with them, patient kind, answering the children's questions about how tomatoes grow with the same careful attention he'd given to explaining wind patterns to snipers. This, Mitchell realized, was Elijah Harper's true legacy, not just the long shots or the combat missions, but the knowledge passed on, whether to Marine snipers or to curious children at a farmer's market. The ability to observe, to understand, and to share that understanding with others. As the family moved on with a bag of fresh tomatoes and peppers, Elijah turned back to Mitchell. "You know, there's something I've been meaning to show you." He reached under the table and brought out a long, slender case, one Mitchell recognized immediately. "My old M40, Elijah said, patting the case. "She's been retired from the range, but I still clean her every Sunday." Habit of a lifetime. Mitchell nodded in understanding. The bond between a sniper and his weapon was something civilians could never fully comprehend. "I've been thinking," Elijah continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Hawkins gave this rifle to me to ensure the knowledge would continue. I've done my part, creating the program and finding the right person to lead it." He pushed the case toward Mitchell. "I think it's time she had a new caretaker." Mitchell stared at the case in shock. "Sir, I can't accept this. That rifle is your history." "And now it's your responsibility," Elijah said firmly. "Not to use her days on the range are done, but to preserve what she represents. The legacy of knowledge passed from Hawkins to me, and now from me to you." With trembling hands, Mitchell accepted the case. Inside lay the M40, its wooden stock still bearing the scars and dents of its long service, including that distinctive gouge near the bolt that had triggered Elijah's memory of Desert Storm. "I don't know what to say," Mitchell admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll continue teaching what that rifle stands for," Elijah replied. "Not just the techniques, but the philosophy that a Marine's most valuable weapon is his mind and his ability to observe and adapt." "I will," Mitchell promised, "for as long as the Corps will let me." Elijah smiled, satisfied. "Good." He glanced again at the flag, which had shifted direction slightly. "Now you'd better get home before that rain hits." "And Mitchell." "Yes, sir. When you make sauce from those tomatoes you are growing, add a splash of red wine. Trust me on this, it makes all the difference." As Mitchell drove home, the rifle case secured carefully on the passenger seat beside him, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. A single moment of arrogance and disrespect had led to the most profound learning experience of his career and to a friendship he now valued above all others. The first fat raindrops began to hit his windshield exactly as Elijah had predicted. Mitchell smiled, no longer surprised by the old sniper's accuracy, whether with a rifle or a weather forecast. Some men simply understood the world at a deeper level. They could read the subtle signs that others missed, interpreting the language of wind and weather, human nature, and ballistics with equal facility. Elijah Harper was such a man, and thanks to him, a new generation of Marine snipers would carry that wisdom forward, learning to trust both their advanced technology and their own observations, becoming more complete warriors in the process. The rain fell harder now, drumming on the truck's roof. Mitchell turned on his wipers and watched the water stream across his windshield, each droplet telling its own small story about the air through which it fell. He was learning to listen, and he would teach others to do the same. In the bed of his truck, nestled among his purchases from the market, sat a flat of tomato seedlings, spaced properly this time, ready for planting in his garden at home. Life, like marksmanship, improved with proper fundamentals and the wisdom to apply them correctly. The rifle in its case beside him represented not just the past, but a future where the hard-won knowledge of previous generations would continue to guide those who followed a legacy as enduring as the Marine Corps itself.